But today we start a new series on Exodus, and we'll start in chapter 1. We'll read about the beginning of the Exodus, or particularly about how the people of Israel are suffering in Egypt and need deliverance. And the book of Exodus being about how that deliverance occurs. So we'll read Exodus chapter 1, and we'll read the first 14 verses of that chapter. Exodus chapter 1, verse 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. Thus far, the reading of Exodus chapter 1. Congregation of Christ, today we begin a new series on the book of Exodus. Exodus, of course, is this grand story of how God delivers his people from the oppression in Egypt. We're going to work through this book chapter by chapter to see how God does that. And what makes Exodus so fascinating as a book is that it reveals God in a completely different way than we see God in Genesis. In Genesis, God creates the world, and then he unites himself to these patriarchs, to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and he protects them and cares for them and makes promises to them. But in Genesis, everything is in micro. It's at first cosmic, but then it goes down to this one group of people who end up being 70 people in all at the end of Genesis. But in Exodus, they turn into a nation. And in Exodus, it's cosmic again. Now, we're talking about world politics. We're talking about how the people of God and God interact on a world stage. And God had said to Abraham, I will make you into a great nation and I will bless you. And that's exactly what happens in Exodus, in Egypt. And we begin to see who is God as a deliverer of his people when they suffer. In Exodus, the people of God have to live in a hostile culture, much in some ways like we are beginning to now. The question we have to ask in our culture today, and many people are asking in China and in Russia, in Iran, and all these places like this, is how do the people of God live in hostile, difficult cultures? How do the people of God endure such living? And second, who is God to us even when the things get hard in our culture and in our time? Does God listen? Does he care? Does God deliver? Is he a rescuer? And how does he rescue? These are all questions that the book of Exodus is going to raise for us now as we live in this culture. In the book of Exodus, the great message will be, look up, for God is here. Well, let's start with the first verses of chapter 1. And you'll notice in chapter 1, if we begin there, you'll see a genealogy. It says there, these are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob. And then you see the list of all the sons. And then you see they were 70 in all when they came to Egypt as a clan. You might read this and you might say, well, so what? This is a genealogy. Let's move on. What's the point? But this genealogy is very important. It's a very important starting point. A genealogy is a record of history. It's a record of where these people came from. Where did they originate? Who are they? And this genealogy tells us that the Israelites in Egypt are not Egyptian. Very important. They don't originate in Egypt. They are foreigners in Egypt. And second, this genealogy points to people, Jacob, Joseph in particular, the sons of Israel, people who belong to God. The thing about Jacob, whenever you read about Jacob in the Bible, and you read about Isaac and about Abraham, the thing that defines them is that God covenanted with them. God built a relationship with them, and therefore they lived under the blessing of God. This is highly significant for how the people are going to live in Egypt, a place that is not God's nation. Jacob has a relationship with God, and Jacob's people have blessing from God. Now, I want to reflect on this for a moment. What does this mean for us today? What does a genealogy like this have to do with you and I? Well, listen, you and I, our number one identifier as people is that we are Christians. Many of us have come here and we label ourselves with, I'm Indian, or I'm Canadian, or I'm this, or I'm that, or I'm Ontarian, whatever you want. But as soon as you walk in here and you become a member of this church, your label changes. In this place, you belong to Jesus. And that is who you are first and foremost. That means, brothers and sisters, that the history of the Bible is your history first. That you share in this history. That what these people suffered is your grandfathers, your parents, just as much as it is theirs. This is the history of the people of God. We, of course, aren't born into God's church by blood necessarily, although we are if our parents are Christian. But really, we're part of God's church by faith. We're grafted in, as it says in Romans, and we are grafted into the family of God that has suffered over the centuries in the Exodus too. And so we need to read this carefully as our own history. And what happened to these people affects us and will likely happen perhaps to us too. Living as the people of God in a hostile world works a certain way. We see in Exodus, and perhaps those patterns are going to extend to us now. So let's keep this in mind. This genealogy is ours. Now, back to the story. Remember that in Genesis, God said that he would bless his people. Now, if you look at verses 6 and 7, you see that this is exactly what happens. Joseph and all of his brothers in that generation die. But God's blessing continues down the generations. God said he would be a God for all of Abraham's children, and he is. And now they'll read this verse carefully. Look at the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. Then they multiplied greatly. 3, they increased in numbers. And 4, became so numerous that the land was filled with them. And in Hebrew, let's remember, paper is expensive when the Bible is written, okay? When something is said multiple different ways again and again, it's highly significant. 4 times the Bible emphasizes that the people were fruitful, the people were fruitful, the people were fruitful. They had many children again and again. They were exceedingly fruitful. Why? What's the point? The point is that God was in it, big time. God was just blessing people with tons of kids all the time. Boom, 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 making them into a great nation. God is with them. And of course, there's echoes of creation here. The language that's used here echoes the be fruitful to multiply command in Genesis. God promised that he would make Abraham fruitful, and he is. Which is ironic because Abraham only had one child. But the blessing of his children is enormous. And so the net result is that Israel grows from 70 people to hundreds of thousands to millions. They are a massive nation. And in the ancient world, that is huge. And only Egypt really had the capacity at the time to even support that number of people. Now, here the problems start in verse 8. The question then becomes, God's people are fruitful. But what do the people around God's people think of this fruitfulness? What do they think of God and his people and their fruitfulness and their blessing? What's the world that doesn't know God going to think of this? In verse 8 we read, a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. Okay, slight diversion. Who's Joseph? Joseph was one of the sons of Jacob. He was sold into slavery by his brothers in Canaan. And the slavers who enslaved Joseph sold Joseph to the leader of Pharaoh's guard, Potiphar, but he was mistreated by the wife of this man, put in prison. But God was with Joseph because while Joseph was in prison, he was able to interpret 2 dreams that Pharaoh had. And because of this, he was given high position in the land of Egypt. And he guided the Egyptians through 7 good years by saving all of their food that they could, so that they could last 7 more tough years. And so Joseph had saved Egypt. One would think that the Egyptians would be grateful to the man that saved Egypt, but here we read that a new king came and he was not grateful. Did not appreciate what Joseph and Joseph's God had done for Egypt. Or maybe, I think the Hebrew language is careful here. I think what this is more saying is he may have remembered, but he didn't care. Pharaoh chose not to remember. He didn't like that memory, and he was going to ignore it. And the point I want to make to you is that the writer, Moses, of Exodus is setting Pharaoh up as a descendant of the seed of the serpent in the Bible. In the Bible, there are 2 types of people. Genesis 3, verse 15, there will be the seed of the serpent that fights the seed of the son, or the seed of Eve, the people of God. And Pharaoh is being set up as the enemy of the people of God. And the question is, what does the seed of the serpent want to do to the people of God? What's their character? What are they like? As we read Exodus, do we identify with the people of God, or are we tempted by the seed of the serpent? It's vital we pay close attention to the seed of the serpent, because the seed of the serpent is alive today too. It starts in verses 9 through 10. What is the seed of the serpent like? What is Pharaoh? How do the people of God come under attack? Well, how does it work? Well, look at verses 9 through 10. Pharaoh says to his people, "Look," he said to his people, "the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." Actually, this, at the end, leave the country, is probably better understood as they will fill the country. It's actually the metaphor there is a flood. They will become like a flood that boils up out of the Nile River and consumes and fills the whole country. And I want to work through this in a series of points. Watch carefully how Pharaoh orchestrates his campaign against the people of God. First, notice how Pharaoh does something that I'm going to call othering. Pharaoh takes the Hebrews who lived in peace with the Egyptians, who had no quarrel with the Egyptians whatsoever. They lived side by side, they were fine. And Pharaoh takes them and he says, you're different than us. You're not us, which is partly true, but Pharaoh uses it against them. You're not like us, you're not worthy of us. And again, I want to point out that this is something that people in our world do all the time. This isn't just a Pharaoh pattern, this is a human pattern. One of the things we love to do, other people, they're not like us. We're Canadian, those people are not Canadian. It's an evil human pattern. And Pharaoh uses it effectively. And the second thing he does on top of that, he then demonizes the other group. Once a group is identified as different than us, they can be demonized and said to have some sort of, and to be dangerous to us. It's exactly what Hitler did in Germany. He takes the Jews, he others them. They're not German. Now they're evil, they're dangerous, they're wrecking our culture. Now we need to do something about them. It happens all the time in our world, and it will happen to Christians too. They're Christians. They don't belong. They're different than us. They don't believe what we believe. It's an ancient pattern that will be used again and again in world history. Now notice something else about what happens here. Pharaoh is speaking to his people. It says here, look, he said to his people. Pharaoh also finds a willing audience in his people. Whenever a person wants to begin dividing people for their own benefit, they need people to support them so that they can get away with what they're about to do. And usually there's always people who are willing to support the evil leader because they get something out of it. I mean, a good example of this is what's happening in India. And the leader of India, Modi, he's Hindu, right? And now he's dividing the country. If you're Muslim or you're Christian, or Sikh in India, you're other, you're different, you're not good because you threaten the unity of the country, which has to be Hindu. And the Hindus support him. Why? Because they get something from this. Status, honor, wealth, whatever it might be. And there's also fear on the other side. Yeah, we are afraid of people who are different than us. They're not like us. Fear and greed, these two massive motivators of evil, or at least these things that lead a population to tolerate evil. Which is why we need to think carefully about even our own fears. Anytime you hold a fear, you will become vulnerable to evil in some way. He plays on the fears of the Egyptians. This nation could take everything from us, so we need to do X, harm, evil. Fear, brothers and sisters, turns a nation into monsters. We need to carefully watch that, even in ourselves. Beyond that, there's a pattern of evil. Whenever you want to demonize a group and destroy them, then you build a coalition of people against them. This is standard operating practice for abusive people, even on a micro level. This goes to number 4. Now that he's demonized, he's built a coalition of people against this group he wants to harm. Now he can do outright harm and enslavement and subjugation. Verse 11, so they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. And the word that's translated as oppressed is a very harsh word. In fact, in Hebrew, it's even harsher. It's afflict. It's degrade, humiliate. forced to submit. They degraded the Israelites by forcing them to do the harshest physical labor in the country. These people are a threat, and we need to destroy them. We need to harshly treat them, otherwise they'll get us. But the ironically is that it's the Egyptians that are the problem. And again, I want to comment on this in our day. Pharaoh's way of thinking and this pattern is common to our day. Pharaoh is evil. Pharaoh is how evil works. This is what we as human culture are always sliding towards this. This is the end point. This is where we're going without God. This kind of life, this kind of world. Point number one, I want to say quickly. We ought not to be gullible on these points. Without God, Pharaoh's world is our world. Christians, I find, often incredibly gullible. We read stories about rapists and murderers, or we read about dictators overseas, or people that are really bad, and we're like, oh, how can people be like this? And it's like, no, this is what people are. The fact that all of us aren't like that is the shocking part. The Bible warns us again and again about how bad evil actually is, and it should not shock us that it gets to this point. Even the Pharisees in Jesus' time, they have murder in their hearts. And Jesus does not entrust himself to them. He knows what's in the heart of man. In the Psalms, in Psalm 83, verse 3, says it this way. See how your enemies growl, how your foes rear their heads. With cunning they conspire against your people. They plot against those you cherish. Come, they say, let us destroy them as a nation so that Israel's name is remembered no more. This is what human beings do. So many countries overseas are a mess. And ours will be too if we let it. And it's also about what the devil wants to do to God's people. Come, let us destroy the Christians so that Christ's name is remembered no more. That's what's happening. That's what the devil wants. And now I'd say it this way too. Here's number 2. The evil of man that we see here is not macro, it's also micro. It can happen at the level of family too. Fathers and mothers and city officials and bosses and your neighbors can behave this way. Pharaoh's actions actually form a sort of a template that's commonly used by people that I see in this neighborhood. People come to us and they describe things that people are doing to them, and it's like this. Enslaving, subjugating, demonizing, breaking people's will, orchestrating all the people in their life against the person to try to lower them and break their spirit. It happens all the time. That is what this world is. And the only liberation from that is God, and we're getting to that. But that's our second point. The people suffer and wait. Now God does win, and what's interesting is in verse 12, we started. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. They were afraid of the Israelites. Why? Because the Israelites had a power within them that the Egyptians could not understand and couldn't beat. At least not the way that they were moving at that time. Brothers and sisters, God always wins. Perhaps the Israelites reminded the Egyptians of their own evil. The Egyptians were embarrassed about their evil, and that caused them to loathe them more, who knows. But they were terrified because the Israelites had something more than human. Evil always recoils on itself, and this is what we see here. Why? Why does evil recoil on itself? Well, because God can use evil to produce good, which is exactly what he does. In Psalm 105, we learn that God is definitely involved in this stage of Israel's history. I'll read verses 23. Then Israel entered Egypt. Jacob resided as a foreigner in the land of Ham. The Lord made his people very fruitful. He made them too numerous for their foes, whose hearts he turned to hate his people, to conspire against his servants. So God gave the Egyptians over to their hate, because he was going to use their hate against them. Very interesting. And so God is bigger than the evil of the Egyptians, and we can already see it. But in the meantime, the Israelites are suffering deeply. We see that in verse 13. The Egyptians worked them ruthlessly, rigorously. There was no let up. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor and brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. And in this verse, there's the word serve or work 5 times. The Egyptians were working the Israelites to death rigorously without let up. Man, and they were suffering bad. We can imagine Egypt. It's like a furnace. The whole country is like this sauna, 50 degrees, 45 degrees every day. They're working in the backbreaking labor with bricks and fields, and the sun is beating down. And then there are these slave masters whipping them. It's just awful. And the question that I think everyone is asking at this point is, if these are God's people, where is God? Now, we've seen God is still working, but still, why isn't he doing more? God has promised to be their God. He's promised to be a God of blessing, and he's not here. I think this is a question many of us are asking. Many of us have endured years of suffering. Maybe we're sick, and it just doesn't really seem to let up. In fact, it kind of gets worse. Maybe we live in an abusive situation. Maybe we live in a situation in which people in our lives are taking advantage of us, and it happens for years. Maybe we're looking for a job and we just can't find it. And we start to wonder, is God here? Does he care? I know. Think about Christians overseas in North Korea. How many years have they suffered? Decades and decades of oppression. Brothers and sisters have been killed. How long? In fact, there's that famous passage in Revelation 6, verse 9. When he opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altars, this altar in heaven, under the altar, the souls of those who have been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they had maintained. And what are these slain people saying? They called out in a loud voice, "How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?" How long do we watch evil have its day? It bothers us. We think, how can God allow this? What's wrong with him? Let me answer this with, I think, the answers of Exodus. As a preview to what God is going to do in the rest of the book. First, where is God in all of this? Well, first of all, God is not surprised by the suffering. He knows it's coming, and it's part of his plan. In fact, he orchestrates our lives so that this particular suffering that we have occurs. Earlier we read Genesis 15, verse where God is speaking to Abraham as part of a covenant. And God says to Abraham, this is long before the Israelites enter Egypt, And he says to him, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. They will be enslaved. This is going to happen. I know it's going to happen. I'm going to orchestrate it. And so we realize that suffering is not an aberration of God's plan. It's not some sort of mistake. No. The suffering we experience is designed and used and specifically orchestrated for us, to benefit us in some way, and also for God to display his glory in some way too. And then verse 14, look what he says. He says, yes, they're going to suffer, but I will punish the nation they serve as slaves. And afterward they will come out with great possessions. So they will come out benefiting from their slavery in the end. And my glory will be had in the way I punish this nation. And so the suffering will be redeemed. And it's the same with us. When we're in it, when we're in the tunnel of turmoil, we could call it, we think, how can this possibly be good? How can this possibly be something that benefits me? How this is so bad. Look what it's doing to me and to the people in my life. I'm sick. I'm flat on my bed. I've got all this work to do. I can't do it. God says, no. This is going to be used. This is something that I have designed for you, for your good in the end. And I'm going to gain glory for how I carry you through this. Now, second, God also hears the prayers of those who are suffering. He is not unmoved by our cries for help. We know that because of the Psalms, and we all know that because of Exodus 2, verse 23. We read the following. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out. Their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning. He remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And so God looked on the Israelites and, listen, was concerned about them. Oh, he looks at the people and their suffering and he says, my heart doesn't like it. God's heart is bothered. I'm concerned. His compassion is drawn out of his heart to his people. Same with you. God looks at your suffering and he looks at it and his compassion emerges from his heart, just like the compassion of Christ comes towards any person who walked to him with suffering. And he looks at you and he's like, yes, I can see that. Yes, that hurts. It hurts me too. He looked at the Israelites and he's like, this is painful. I feel it. And he heard them. He always hears our prayers. And third, God answers our cries by saving us. Maybe not today. Like Israel, we may have to wait decades for salvation. Patience is a virtue. And Jesus waited thousands of years to save us. Right? The Israelites had to wait, I don't know how long they actually suffered under slavery. It could have been 50, 100 years. It's sort of my guess. Maybe less, maybe 20 or 30 years. However long it was a long time. But salvation was coming. In Exodus, the salvation comes through a man, Moses. But for us, the New Testament people of God, the new Moses is Jesus. And Jesus saves us as Moses was used to save Israel. Jesus is the answer that this is anticipating. This is guiding us towards Christ. Moses is going to come and lead his people out of Egypt. He's going to lead his people out of the furnace of sin and hell and suffering. And he's going to lead them into the promised land. And the same happens with you. Whatever your suffering is, Jesus leads you out of the world of suffering into the promised land. Perhaps in this life, but definitely the next. And he is the answer to human suffering and to the pharaohs of the world. Why? Why is Christ the answer like Moses? Well, first of all, Jesus suffered as we did, or as we do. Jesus bears the scars of suffering on his hands. Jesus endured slavery and misery like us. He carried the burden of the cross just as the Israelites carried the baskets of dirt on their back. And his burden was his sin. The basket on his back was filled with our sin and with the wrath of God. That was a way heavier burden than any of us will ever have to carry. Heavier than the bricks of Israel. And second, Jesus absolutely hears our cries and has filled with compassion for us, just as God was filled with compassion for Israel. He says that his heart is gentle and lowly. That means he has no ego, no pride that would prevent him or no pride that would lead him to other you, to push you over there and say, you're different than me. No, he has no pride. He's always, his arms are open and he welcomes all people. He's not like Pharaoh. He exists to give and nothing prevents him from doing it. And third, Jesus is the opposite of Pharaoh. Jesus does not come to earth to create an empire of mud bricks. Cities like Pithom and Ramses. You see, we live in a culture that's using your labor, that's using the labor of all the people to build grand monuments and shining glass towers in Toronto. A culture that wants to build an empire of wealth and entertainment. Many of us work for companies that use our labor and that do not care. That do not appreciate us. Our labor is given for the leaders to build wealth. They'll fire us as soon as we're not useful. Not to say we shouldn't work for companies or this, but it's just, who is Jesus? What is he like? Well, he's not like what we're used to. He's a person who comes to earth to give, to build you up. That's why the church, think about this. The church is Jesus' creation. The church is what Jesus is building up. He exists to lift you up so that you become the temple instead of building a stone and brick temple over there with your labor. The Pharaoh wants to use you to build his own ambition. Jesus uses himself to build you. Jesus is not a tyrant, but he's a deliverer from tyrants. He's not an enslaver, he's a liberator. He builds us up. Whatever bricks are in Jesus' kingdom are used as stones to build us up. We don't need to live our lives building bricks for someone else. Fourth, Jesus promises to destroy the pharaohs of this world. Jesus sets his face against Pharaoh and all evil men, and eventually he will destroy them. And Jesus is working to build a heaven and a new earth that's free from tyranny of any kind. The only person who doesn't get to go to heaven is the person who refuses to stop being like Pharaoh. Fifth, Jesus does not participate in the othering or demonization of other groups. And Jesus' people may never do that either. No matter who's out there or what group they belong to or what history they have. We as Christians treat them with love and compassion no matter what. The only person that is not welcome, for example, in the church or in the people of God is the person who does not want it. But any person who wants it can have it. There's no Jew or Greek or Scythian or Indian or Korean or Chinese, Persian, Mexican, South American, African. Not in this place. Jesus says, do you trust in my name? Do you believe in me? Do you want liberation? Then come, anyone, whoever you are. And even if you're not going to come, we're not going to hate you. We're still going to love you too. Jesus is the antithesis of the seed of the serpent in Egypt. And so, brothers and sisters, the message today is, look hard at the city of man. Look at it. Don't be tempted by that thing. Forsake that city and come to the city of God in Jesus Christ. Come to Jesus to be part of the people of God. Do not be tempted by that world and its ways, because they have been unmasked as evil. Come to Jesus today and enter the people of God and cry out, how long, Lord, until you return? And may Jesus answer you, you may have to suffer for a time until I return and take you home. And he will. Amen.